Hi, and welcome to the second episode of the SIS Baseball Podcast. I'm Mark Simon. The lineup for today's show will be joined by Tyler Kepner, national baseball writer from the New York Times. He's the author of a new book about pitching, and we'll talk about the intersection of pitching and defense, as well as some of the top pitches in the game. My colleague Andrew Kyne will join us in a segment we'll call Under Review, where we'll talk about some of the latest research and work we're doing, go through some leaderboards. We'll ask and answer a few questions as well. And then we'll close with the ridiculous numbers of the day. We like to start the show with a quick take on something notable from the first couple of weeks in the majors. The Padres made two dramatic moves this past offseason, first signing Manny Machado to a $300 million contract and putting 20-year-old top prospect shortstop Fernando Tatis Jr. on their major league roster on opening day. In doing so, they may have created baseball's new defensive dynamic duo. Together, they've already combined for 10 runs saved. Machado returned to his best position, third base, after struggling at shortstop in 2018. He has 5 runs saved in 2019 and looks a lot more like his old self so far. Machado has posted as many as 35 defensive runs saved in a season. His norm is in the low teens. When he's right, Machado shows great range, both going down the line and in the hole. He makes a lot of great plays, and he makes very few mistakes. Tatis has been very good. He has 5 runs saved in 2019. He's gotten to balls in the shortstop third base hole that others don't get. That's notable because it's something that he didn't do last season at the minor league level. It was his biggest weakness. The Padres have positioned him well, giving him a chance to make those plays. The Padres' infield defense was good last year, but this season it may be great. They have one of the game's best scoopers of throws, Eric Hosmer, at first base. So he should help both Tatis and Machado a lot. And here's some perspective on just how good Tatis and Machado are already. We mentioned the 10 defensive runs saved. No other team has more than 5 from the left side of the infield. If the Padres contend in 2019, the bats of Machado and Tatis figure to play a big role. This is a team on the rise, albeit one with a no-name pitching staff. The expectation may have been to contend in 2020. But perhaps they can move up the clock a year. And the key to that may be in just how well they play in the field. And we transition from a team with a lot of unknown pitching to the writer of a book about great pitching. Tyler Kepner is the author of the new book, K, A History of Baseball in 10 Pitches. He's the national baseball writer for the New York Times. We have a good relationship with the Times, and we bring Tyler on now. And our first question is a 3-parter. Who are the most interesting pitchers to talk to for the book? Give me an old-timer, a recently retired, and a current pitcher, and tell us why.
Well, there were so many, Mark, who were great. But when you ask that question, the first guy I think of from the old-timers was Carl Erskine from the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was just tremendous. He had stories about meeting Three Finger Brown at the team hotel when he was a minor leaguer, and getting to see his gnarled hand and learning how it gave him such a great grip on the curveball. That was really cool, just to go back in time like that, to talk to someone who knew kind of one of these ghosts of the game. And he told stories about the early days of baseball, in terms of like the curveball and whether or not it actually existed. Whether it was a thing that the physics allowed to happen. How that was like still a question back in the 50s when he was pitching. He talked about Preacher Row and how he threw spitballs and everything. He talked about warming up in the bullpen and at the Polo Grounds, and bouncing his curveball in the dirt. And then that was why the Dodgers went with Ralph Branca instead of him to give up the famous home run, the shot heard around the world in '51. So he was just a treasure trove of great stories, and just a really, really nice man as well. And as far as recently retired, I mean, I learned more from Mike Mussina than any pitcher I ever covered in 12 years as a beat writer, or ever since as a national writer. We had a 2-hour lunch up there in Montoursville, Pennsylvania, just going over every pitch and his philosophies about the craft and the game. He was just terrific, as I hoped he would expected him to be. He's great. And of the current guys, there are a lot of good ones, but the one who jumps out at me is I really wanted to go deep on the pitch that won the World Series for the Cubs, just because it had been such an anticipated moment for so long, 108 years. And it happened to be Mike Montgomery, kind of a swingman kind of guy in the bullpen, who came up, to throw curveballs to get Michael Martinez out there in the bottom of the ninth for the first save of his career. And I had never talked to Mike, and I talked to him that off season for a long time on the phone, probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. He was just tremendous, just talking about, step by step how he developed that pitch over the years and through all the trades he'd had and all the ups and downs, how he found himself in that moment. I felt there was kind of just something sort of poignant that it would be a somewhat obscure guy who got to be on the mound for that magic moment. So he could have been any kind of guy, and he turned out to be a really, really insightful, interesting dude.
You go from Mordecai Brown to Mike Montgomery, and you wonder now what guys like Mordecai Brown and Carl Erskine might think of things like TrackMan and Rapsodo and some of these new technologies that are evaluating pitchers. You just read about Wes Johnson, the Twins pitching coach. Did you talk to pitchers about how their pitches were evaluated over time? Like, how did they know that they were throwing the ball well back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s as compared to now?
Well, I think a lot of it was maybe a little more intuition, let's say, than a lot of pitchers might have now. I think in general, all the data and the equipment is tremendous because it can point out exactly what you're doing right or doing wrong. It can give you areas to emphasize in your preparation, that maybe you didn't even know about. Like if you didn't know that your pitch, this one particular pitch had an incredible spin rate, let's say, maybe you wouldn't work as hard on developing it into a weapon, or you might be concentrating on the wrong things. But I think back then it was a little more intuition because a lot of these guys just had to figure it out on their own. I mean, the coaching was not nearly as sophisticated or even as widespread. I mean, often I was surprised to learn that most times, I guess, there was individual minor league teams did not have pitching coaches. It was just one sort of roving instructor who would go through the farm system and come through town every month or so and talk to the kids, and then, all right, guys, go get them, and I'll see you in a month or whatever. And they were largely left to their own devices, and so that left time for a lot of experimentation on their own and everything, but also just a lot of uncertainty as to what was really working and what wasn't. I mean, Steve Rogers used to talk about Cal McLish, who was actually a very well-regarded pitching coach, but he would just tell them, get out front, son, and get whippy. And he's like, well, what do I mean? Get out in front and get whippy. Like, that's the only thing this coach is telling me. And there was some wisdom to it because you do need a whipping action at the end of your arm, at the end of your wrist and hand, to give the pitch a little life. But like, he didn't exactly have a whole lot else besides that. I mean, Andy Pettit would talk about, Hoyt Wilhelm coaching him in the minor leagues and just saying, just keep turning them to the right, Pettit. Just keep turning them to the right, meaning like just keep sending them back to their own dugout. I was like, okay, like I'll just try to keep getting them out. Like it wasn't a whole lot of sophisticated instruction like you can get now from all that data.
I want to tie this into something that we have. We have a command rating that we showed off when we were on MLB Network last year that showed which pitchers are best able to hit the mitt, so to speak. And I remember Kyle Hendricks was one of the guys that topped the list in terms of frequently being able to hit his catcher right on the target. Who are some of the guys that you're most impressed with in terms of command of a pitch?
Well, one guy who's always impressed me with his command is Madison Bumgarner. I wanted to talk to him for the fastball chapter because I'm just intrigued by sort of how much conviction he has with that pitch. And maybe it's more conviction than command exactly, but Bumgarner just believes in his fastball so well, and he's just fearless in the way he uses it. Not the hardest fastball in the game, or even one of them, but I wanted to bring into focus the last out of Game 7 of the 14 World Series when a home run by Sal Perez would win the World Series for the Royals, and an out would win it for the Giants, what they call a golden pitch in Sabre. Montgomery actually had the same situation in 16, but the one in the Giants Royals case was maybe a little more heightened because of as a power hitter at the plate. and Perez had hit a home run off Bumgarner earlier in the series. In fact, the only run he's ever given up in the World Series was a solo homer to Sal Perez. So here he comes with Gordon on third. All of a sudden, after the error in the outfield, with 2 outs in the ninth, and Bumgarner went with only fastballs in that moment. And so we dug in pretty deep on his thinking and his rationale, that whole at bat. And why he didn't throw anything else. Obviously, as a guy in third, you don't want to bounce something or have something, a pitch get by the catcher and bring home the tying run. But it was mainly just about his belief that Perez was going to be anxious in that spot, and he's sort of naturally in swing mode anyway. So he felt really comfortable climbing the ladder there. But if you miss in that spot, if you're trying to throw up and you miss by 6 inches or so, that could be the difference between winning the World Series and losing it right there, because you're in a dangerous territory. But it was just interesting to me how he had such conviction that he was going to command that pitch and put it exactly where he wanted it, in a dangerous spot and get away with it, and he did. So I don't know where he has ranked over the years on that metric, but I felt like that was a good example anyway of what superior command can do.
A good catcher makes a good pitcher too, and Madison's got a great one. Buster Posey. Did you talk to pitchers at all about the work of their catchers and the pitch framing that their catchers did?
Not exactly so much framing, no. That really wasn't much of an emphasis for me in terms of who can steal strikes better than others. I know that's been obviously a huge part of catching metrics. I did a big story on catching late in spring training about how last year was, I think, the worst year offensively for catchers ever. But a lot of coaches and managers, evaluators would say that it's just because, or largely because, the defensive metrics have gotten so advanced, and they know that a defensive catcher can be such a valuable weapon for a team that more than ever they're prioritizing defense and framing at that position. And if you can hit, it's very secondary to your value there. So a team like the Red Sox was perfectly happy having catchers who hardly contributed offensively last year, but they won the World Series, and their catchers were really, really good at framing. And hey, you have a guy like Jeff Mathis who doesn't contribute much with the bat and is older, but was able to sign a 2-year contract. With Texas, as they try to transition from a veteran team eventually to a new ballpark and a younger staff, they felt it was good to have a guy like Mathis there, and framing got him 2 extra years where he might not have had that in the past, because even though he was good defensively, he might have just been labeled as a 199 hitter, and so it's really been an important revelation in the current game, and serving also to sort of bring down the offensive worth of catchers, just because their defense is so important.
2 more questions for Tyler Kepner. Rapid fire kind of one. Pick your 3 favorite pitches in baseball today.
There's so many. I mean, I like thinking of the full arsenal of guys, but seeing Kershaw again the other night, last night coming back, seeing that curveball again was really pretty. You see some of the action on some guys' sinkers now, which is just ridiculous. Jose Alvarado on the Rays has recently gotten to be fun to watch with the way that 2-seamer moves. I'm still sort of, I still sort of think of the classics. Like I'll take the Max Scherzer slider and just that turbo action. I'll say the Max Scherzer slider. I still go back to the Clayton Kershaw curve, and I gotta give you a good one, kind of an obscure one. There's let me think. I don't know. I mean, maybe just because I sort of default to some of the older guys, but I still love watching Cole Hamels, throw that changeup and just baffle guys like that. I mean, those are 3 guys who've been doing it for a long time. But a slider, curveball, changeup. That's a pretty good list. They've got a lot of accomplishments for those guys. So they've proven it over time.
All right, last question. We're a defense company largely, defensive run saved, shifting data, all the different things related to that. You, people may not know this, are a baseball card maven, so to speak. You are very into them. Let's say we paired up and we created defensive-based baseball cards. What should they look like?
Well, I think they ought to look like the 73 tops, where you had a little guy in silhouette in the corner, sort of like in his defensive position. I kind of like that. I kind of like the how that sort of emphasized defense a little bit. So maybe we go with a retro set with a little 73 tops design, and of course we could only spotlight defensive plays on the photos. So that would be fun. And I always like the cards that'll have a defensive play, because sometimes you can actually go back and see like, oh well, there was only one play at the plate, involving Mike Fitzgerald and Wally Backman. So, it must have been this exact play, something like that. So I kind of like that, where you can go back and cross-reference it. But what I would like on the back of the cards is maybe, instead of just the stats or whatever, I mean, you could have some stats, maybe an explanation of the player about his equipment, like his glove. How long has he had the glove? Because sometimes that's fun. Like, this guy's had the glove since 2006, and he's been using it every day, or just sort of a description of like a photo of the glove, or like how it's been broken in, and maybe like a pro tip for either how you play the position or how you break in your equipment, and and then some stats on the glove. That's what I'd like to hear.
Let's go into business. Sounds good. The book is A History of Baseball in 10 Pitches. It's the #1 baseball book on Amazon.com. You can find it there or wherever books are sold. Tyler Kepner, thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
We're calling this next segment Under Review. My colleague Andrew Kyne joins us, and we're going to talk about takeaways from the first couple of weeks, leaderboards, and answer a couple of reader mail or listener mail questions. And we'll start with takeaways from the first 2 weeks of the season. And we had talked about this, I think, on the first show. 2 teams with significant shift increases this season so far. Not who you would expect, although if you think about it, makes sense. One is the Marlins. The Marlins were shifting the Rockies 20-25 times a game in the first series of the season. They've scaled back from that a little bit, but they've still been pretty aggressive when it comes to defensive shifting. They are the leader right now. Them and the Baltimore Orioles are also an aggressive team when it comes to defensive shifting, which makes sense when you think about the fact that their general manager, Mike Elias, is formerly with the Houston Astros, brings over a philosophy and brings over kind of a guru of analytics in Sig Maydal, and they impart this new philosophy. And what they're doing really aggressively is they're shifting right-handed hitters like nobody else. They're shifting like half of the ones that come up. They are taking chances. They're playing, admittedly, with a shortstop that was a Rule 5 pick. And I think that they're willing to take this season as somewhat of an experiment to see if things like going aggressive against right-handed hitters can work a little bit. And thus far, the results are kind of mixed for both teams. They're not among the shifting leaders in terms of shift runs saved by any means. But I think it's something that you really have to keep an eye on over the course of the season. Andrew, what's your biggest takeaway from the first couple of weeks?
My biggest takeaway has to do with the Mariners and what they're doing and how they're winning in spite of their defense. Entering this week, they were already at minus 28 defensive runs saved, which was the worst in baseball. They had the most defensive misplays and errors in baseball, and yet they were 13-5.
And minus 28.
Yeah, it's very significant, and we kind of saw that last year with the Phillies, and we saw how their poor defense caught up to them. The Mariners, are obviously hitting very well to make up for that lack of run prevention, but I'll be interested to see what happens if their offense starts to regress a little bit, but their defense stays where it is.
The biggest culprit for them is Omar Narvaez?
Right, yeah. Behind the plate, he's cost them, I believe, 6 or 7 runs. Also, Domingo Santana has cost them in the outfield a little bit.
It's funny, when Santana was on the Brewers, his defensive numbers weren't that bad. They were actually all right. Narvaez, a replacement for Mike Zunino, that's a little bit of a challenge. Zunino's known for framing. Narvaez is known for taking pitches out of the strike zone. We go from the worst team in defensive runs saved. I want to mention the best team. I want to give the shout out to the Giants, who lead the majors with 30 defensive runs saved. Two notable names there. Steven Duggar leads the majors with 7. He's a great outfielder for Oracle Park, not AT&T anymore, because he can really go back and get the ball. He can chase a lot of balls down. There are going to be a lot of deep fly balls get into that ballpark where there's going to be room to make catches that are going to be of high value. He's able to do that. Kevin Pillar is a good addition there. It allows Duggar to move to right. Also want to point out that Buster Posey has looked maybe not good at the plate, but very strong behind the plate in terms of pitch framing, throwing guys out. Staff ERA has been very good with him behind the plate so far. So we go from team leader to position lead. And I'm looking at the defensive run save leaderboard. We mentioned Steven Duggar in the outfield with 7, Acuna with 6, Ronald Acuna off to a good start. The numbers are really kind of dicey at this point in the season, so we're looking for clues more than we're looking for absolutes. Guys that might be off to good starts, guys that look good, guys that have home run robberies tend to fare very well here in the early going. Aaron Judge, Lorenzo Cain, Mike Trout among the guys with 5. Martin Maldonado is off to a good start with 4. Which we said behind the plate, he's the best defensive catcher in baseball. Mookie Betts, Matt Chapman, usual suspects. I do want to point out Ramon Laureano. He's already got 4 outfield arm runs saved. Might have the best arm in the major leagues in terms of base runner deterrence. In terms of good fielding plays, and remember that we have people who chart good fielding plays and defensive misplays. Your leaders early there. I think it's the one to point out is Carlos Correa, who had an off year defensively last season. He's the leader at shortstop. Joe Paddock at second base. Mentioned the Giants were doing well. Matt Chapman at third. Puig in the outfield, and Anthony Rizzo at first base. All right, let's talk form and outfields. Andrew Kyne's done the work on that. We brought that up before the season started. We updated with the start of the season.
Sure. So we've charted 18 four-man outfields on batted balls so far, and that's actually comprised of just 2 teams, one being the Tampa Bay Rays, who I think everyone might have expected to increase their four-man outfield usage given what they did in spring training, but also the Cincinnati Reds. The Reds have done it 10 times. They've done it against Matt Carpenter, who we talked about on the last podcast as a possible candidate, as someone who would fit the strategy. Yasmani Grandal, Travis Shaw, Curtis Granderson, and the Rays did it against Brandon Belt of the Giants and Justin Smoke of the Blue Jays. Those batters are actually 6 for 18 against the four-man outfield, which does not sound great so far. However, I did see it one of the times that the Reds tried it on Grandal. He actually hit a ball down into the corner, and they were able to hold him to a single, where if it was the traditional alignment, it probably would have been a double. So you see that, and then Grandal actually also tried to bunt on them, which is something that we talked a little bit about on the last podcast, and it didn't work. He tried to bunt it down the third base line, but the pitcher fielded it cleanly. So we're still going to see where it goes in terms of its effectiveness, but it's something that, even though it's only been done by these 2 teams so far, it's already almost halfway to the number that we saw last year. So it's definitely increasing.
We're definitely going to see more of those over the course of the season. I'll be curious if it's done A, by the Rays, and B, on Grandal, and C, on Brandon Belt, who is a notorious ground ball puller. We get to questions. We had a couple of people write into our Twitter with questions. Sportsinfo_SIS, if you want to hit us up on Twitter. Matt Trueblood writes in, now that we have data on defensive positioning in the outfield, have you studied whether there's a connection between how deep a guy plays and how he performs on deep and or shallow balls? Any surprising individual performances?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and we've done a little bit of research into that, and I looked into it a little bit yesterday as well when we got the question. But one of the things that we do for DRS is we break out plays saved into shallow, medium, and deep buckets. And as Matt mentioned in his question, we can now look at defensive positioning in the outfield. So comparing those 2 things for players with a large enough sample, there's a pretty strong correlation between a player's average depth and his plays saved in those buckets. So if a player's average depth is shallow, he tends to save more plays on shallow balls and fewer plays on deep balls. And the opposite is true if the player's average depth is deep. The break-even point, if you want to call it that, or where play saved crosses zero, essentially, is right around the average depth for all three outfield spots. In the corners, it's around 290 to 295 feet. In center, it's around 315 to 320 feet. So, for example, if you play deeper than 320 feet in center field, you're likely to save more plays on deep balls and fewer plays on shallow balls. And I think that's all pretty intuitive. Now, when we start to convert play saved into run saved, our public DRS system, which doesn't consider a fielder's starting positioning, has something of a natural bias in favor of defending deep balls well, since deeply hit balls have a higher run value associated with them. So in terms of individual performances, I think that Billy Hamilton is a pretty interesting one because the Reds positioned him pretty shallow when he was with Cincinnati. And he's always excelled on those shallow balls, but not so much on deep balls. And his positioning likely had something to do with that. But again, with the run values and essentially biasing in favor of deep balls, his lesser performance on those balls probably brought his DRS down maybe more than we might have expected given his defensive reputation.
And now the Royals have moved him back.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see if his DRS in the public system without considering his positioning is improved.
Second question from Joshua Housen. How do defensive metrics weigh a play like what happened in the April 11th game between Toronto and Boston, where Randall Grichuk was camped under a fly ball but missed it because Socrates Brito ran into him? Do either of them get hurt by that? Both?
Yeah, so we went back and we watched this play, and Mookie Betts hits a pretty routine fly ball to center field. Randall Grichuk is camped under it, but Brito drifts over, and although he didn't actually make contact with him, he distracted him enough to the point where Grichuk let it bounce off his glove and he dropped it. So Grichuk was charged with an error, and in a situation like that, DRS can actually penalize both of them. So Grichuk bears the majority of that penalty, having been charged with the error and getting his glove on the ball without any extraordinary effort. So he's penalized for not being able to convert a routine play. But additionally, we have our defensive misplay system, which has run values associated with some of the various types of misplays, one being cutting off a better positioned fielder. So that applies when a fielder is literally cutting in front of a guy who had a better chance of making a play. But it also applies if he's just interfering with another fielder's ability to make the play. So on a play like that, Brito can actually lose some credit for essentially disrupting the play.
And he does.
Yeah.
All right. If you want to send us a question, sportsinfo_SIS on Twitter. Love to hear from you. Love to hear what you think about the podcast. We'll be doing more of these over the course of this season. Let's go to the ridiculous number of the day. All right. What do you got?
Sure. So since the start of 2018, Cody Bellinger is batting .360 on grounders and short liners against the shift. And interestingly, it was .360 last year when he went 50 for 139 and .360 exactly this year as he's 9 for 25. Lefties have only hit about .250 on grounders and short liners against the shift since the start of last season. So I think that hitting .360 is pretty ridiculous and something that we might have to look into a little bit more.
If you watch him and you've watched this strong start to the season, one thing that he can do is he can take the ball into that wedge between second base and where the shortstop normally plays and sneak it through, regardless of whether there's a guy there or not, to compensate for the defensive shift that's played against him. He's been outstanding against that both last season, and now he's carried that over into this season. All right, we close the show with the ridiculous number, my ridiculous number. All the talk with Tyler about pitching got me to wondering about unheralded dominance and guys with dominant pitches that you might not think of. And I went looking through our pitch data, and we keep this stuff. You can Power's a lot of Fangraphs. I should point that out. I was looking, is there someone for whom I could say someone is like 6 for 100? I wanted single digit for triple digits since the start of last season. There's only one guy. That would be the closer for the Giants, Will Smith. Since the start of last season, opponents are 9 for 104 against his slider. He's throwing it for a strike 73% of the time. Hitters miss on almost half their swings against it. He only throws his fastball 93, which is nothing for a closer, but he's dominant because he has one of the most unknown weapons in the game. Thank you for listening to the SIS Baseball Podcast. If you'd like to give us feedback, please review us on iTunes or email us at mark@sportsinfosolutions.com. I'm Mark Simon. For Andrew Kyne and Tyler Kepner, we'll catch you down the road.